thank you again for that kind introduction. You may have figured out I'm James Urban. I'm a professor at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and I'm in the Department of Fire Protection Engineering. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of fire protection engineering as a discipline before? It's actually more than I thought, which is pretty good. And so I'll get into that a little bit later, but my research focuses mostly on what I call fundamental material flammability. And that's basically the science of understanding how things ignite, how they burn, and how flames will spread over them. And the big theme in that is wildfire, but it's not exclusively wildfire. But I'll admit most of my research is related to wildfire. But my goal is to understand the physics of how it burns, how it ignites, and how it spreads. And so I'm going to cover a couple things here today. Most of it's going to be some recent research we've done, but I'm also just going to introduce the school, WPI. It's a smaller school from a different area. You may not have heard of it. And then also fire protection engineering as a discipline very briefly because it's kind of unusual. And then I'm going to talk about the WUI fire problem. I'll explain what exactly WUI stands for and the WUI research that I've been doing. And then as part of that, I'll talk about a research project where we looked at firebrand spotting as a structure ignition pathway in wild and urban interface fires. And then at the end, I have a couple slides discussing areas where I think engineers can contribute to WUI fires. And wildfires, I'll also talk about this later, are a big space. There's a lot of people involved, a lot of stakeholders. And I would say traditionally engineers have been sort of late to the game. And so it can be kind of confusing if you're coming in and don't know much about the field. So unfortunately, Daniel, I have to correct you. It's pronounced Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And if you're really from New England, it's Worcester or Worcester. And I'm probably doing it wrong. And so and I grew up in the Midwest, so I can't do it right. But it's all these letters in Worcester are like not really that necessary. It's really Worcester. Or some people call it the woo, which I don't do. And so WPI is right here in Worcester, so right about where that circle is. And if you sort of squint and say, oh, this is Boston, there are these rings around it, we're sort of in the very outer stretches of the Boston area. And that's like a really stretching the definition of the Boston area. But we're sort of around Boston, but really we're like central Massachusetts. Our school is fairly small, and has historically focused mostly on teaching. And we were an early innovator and adopter of a project-based learning curriculum. And more recently, we've been increasing our research activity. And then fire protection engineering. It's a department at WPI that I'm in, and we are only one of 3 schools that have an FPE department. And we're the only school to offer a PhD in fire protection engineering. And typically, the FPE discipline is focused on indoor fires. So if you've got a fire in a room like this, how do you make it a safe place for people to be? And so we've got like exit lights here, there's smoke detectors somewhere, and there's sprinklers, those little circles on the sides. And there's a lot of effort that's been done to engineer these systems to make these rooms safe. However, there's been a gaping blind spot, which is the outside of the house. And recently we've had a lot of large loss wildland urban interface fires. So those are WUI fires, and those have become a growing topic. And actually our department, in terms of the research active faculty, almost all of our research is outside of the building, so to speak. We do have some research that looks at fires indoors, but a lot of it is looking at wildland urban interface fires or oil spill fires and things like that. And I have a video here that, see if I can play it. This is just showcasing some of our laboratory facilities and research. This is a tree, so you can think of it as like a Christmas tree. It's about the size of a person, and we're able to burn things like this in our lab. And this is some preliminary work that was done by our department head, Professor Simeone, and right now we have a project working to look at now what happens if you've got multiple trees in the presence of wind, and how does the fire spread from one to the other, and then potentially also to buildings. And then this is our the building we're in. We're located on the first floor on this side of the building, and then there's this big tan box on the outside, which is our lab. And so you can see it's about 3 stories tall, and we can do burns like this and there, where you have about a 3 megawatt fire, and flames that can be about 4 meters tall. And just a reference point: a fire this big is big enough that you feel uncomfortable in the room. And we know that it's safe, but it's a lot of heat, and it's all going off at once. And I also want to acknowledge my research team. I'm going to present some research, but it's important to know, that the students are the ones who do most of the work, and also the postdocs. In particular, Luke King, who's my most senior PhD student, did most of the research that I'm presenting here today. So I have to thank him for that. And we also have undergraduate students working in the lab as well. So now I'm going to talk about the WUI fire problem, or the wildland-urban interface problem in the United States. And here I'm saying in the United States, but this is a problem everywhere else as well. But I live in the United States. All my funding agencies are in the United States. It's where I grew up, so it's mostly focused in that realm. And so I think the first thing to do is to define what the WUI is. And so there's sort of two different definitions, but really the wildland-urban interface is the best definition. And so it's a case where you have civilization basically on one side of the line, and on the other side you have a unmanaged or rural or wildland area on the other side. You can also have what's called intermixed WUI, where you might find as you approach a sort of a more rural area, where you've got sparsely plopped down houses and buildings that are in a mostly unmanaged area. And then you can also have an urban environment, and it is possible to have fires going through there, and then also a wildland and rural environment where you can also have fires. And the key difference here is a WUI fire, you're looking at fires that are assaulting a building, and there's usually people involved. There's a lot of wildland fires and rural fires that happen that you never hear about. And that's because it's sort of like, if the tree falls in the forest, nobody hears it. Did it happen? And so here, those wildfires that are happening in these wildland areas, they don't really affect us. And so we don't really worry about them or think about them. But when they actually start threatening communities, that's when we start to care. And that's when you see, news headlines or, news reports, and they show these big, scary images. And so all of those visuals you've seen are probably a WUI fire, not a true wildland fire. And then I sort of maybe misuse this term a little bit, but I try to use wildfires as sort of a catch-all for all of these sort of like large-scale outdoor fires. And so I sort of mentioned before, WUI fires, it's a key component of that is like structures are involved. And really our motivation is to prevent structure ignition in WUI fires. This is a picture from the 2018 Camp Fire in California. And you'll see that there's these nice footprints of houses that are all reduced to ash in various plots of land around here. And if you look closely, it maybe doesn't show up that well on the projector screen, but there's actually patches of green grass and trees that have still their foliage intact. And what's, I think, very counterintuitive here is the houses are burning, but most of the vegetation is fine. There are definitely some cases where vegetation, maybe near the house is definitely charred. But when we think of a wildfire, often we think of like a wall of flames moving through, say, a forest or a community, but it's actually not how it behaves in the WUI. You have a lot of discrete ignitions of one structure to the next, or maybe other things that are attached to the structure, like ornamental vegetation, sheds, or fences. And I'm going to go over a couple of major WUI fires of varying degrees. So I mentioned before the Camp Fire, which was in 2018, and this is the costliest WUI fire worldwide. It burned 18,000 structures. There were 85 deaths. It was the 6th deadliest in the U.S. history and the most deadliest in California. And there were a lot of contributing factors. There was a lot of drought, which drove extreme wildfire behavior. And some of that behavior includes things like firebrand spotting. But also with these fires is an element where, we're looking at the impact on people. And so there's things like evacuation routes that were very limited in this community that played a big role. And in this picture here, you can see there are these streets here, which are motion blurred firebrands. So firebrands are like, you can imagine a piece of charcoal or just a piece of like a burning branch or twig that gets blown by the wind, and then it can land on something and ignite it. And so they could be very good for just a wildfire spreading. They can, one of these pieces gets flown ahead of the fire line, it lands on a receptive fuel, it ignites it. And so we would call that like a firebrand, a spot fire. And eventually it can merge with the fire front and sort of create a bigger fire. But when you've got a WUI fire, these firebrands can then land on homes and ignite them on very vulnerable components. And it can also be a little bit different where you need to have a lot of them. One firebrand by itself maybe isn't enough, but if you've got a pile of them on a wooden deck or something, that can ignite it. And so I think a lot of times when we think of wildfires, we think of the West and California, but wildfires can happen really anywhere. So this is an example of one that happened in Texas, in Bastrop County, which I think is not too far from here. And in this case, I think this happened back in 2011, and at that time this was fairly big. And since then we've had several much bigger fires, but it's still, this is a major buoy fire. There were 5,000 people evacuated. There were almost 1,700 structures burned, which is the most in Texas history. And there were several contributing factors. There was a lot of wind damage to power lines. And so typically power line involved fires happen when there's high winds. And so you also then have very bad flame spread conditions in those cases. There was a drought, and then there was extreme fire behavior like firebrand spotting, where firebrands were igniting spot fires up to 3 miles away. And so if you think about it, that's pretty far for a wildfire to reach. And then this is a fire that happened actually just this month in New Jersey, which is maybe not the first place you'd think of. I looked it up in Google Maps and I can't remember exactly, but I think it's about a 2-hour drive from New York City. And this fire happened just this month, and it wasn't nearly as big as the other ones, but there was a lot of extreme fire behavior. You can see the tall flame lengths there. You can see some little spot fires. And I think this is a video, so we can play it. But so we're looking at like 60-meter tall flames. So this is very unusual. And so in this case, this is maybe more of a wildland fire, but it was nearby a military base. So there's some issues there too. And so you may think, why are there so many more wildfires now? Because in the news recently, at least in the past 5 years, I've seen a lot more reports of this. But actually, this isn't the case. Got a little ahead of myself. We actually have about the same number of fires historically. And maybe even if you look closer to here, you might see a downward trend. And so then, that doesn't really jive with the, what we see on the news. But one thing is changing. Well, there's probably several things, but one of them is we're seeing larger fires. And so if you look at the area burned is clearly increasing for the number of fires staying constant. And actually, in a lot of cases, it's not like all fires are getting bigger. We have a couple that are just very big, and it skews the stats. It shows, it just takes one to cause a whole lot of damage. And interestingly, if you look at other states, you may see different trends. I know in California, actually, you see a decrease in the number of fires. And so if you look at the contributing factors here, there's a lot of them. I think one that people point to a lot that actually I don't think is the biggest one is climate change. There's a lot of other ways in which our actions impact fires. The biggest one is people move closer to where fires happen. And that's why we see a lot more. And then also when we go to those places, we change the way we use the land, and we put out fires when they happen. And that leads to fuel accumulation, which is bad. And then also that goes into the fire management and response. And so here there's some data showing the area of the wildland urban interface, number of housing units, and the population. And you can see it's just growing. And so that brings us to the fire exclusion paradox. And so this idea is how we manage the land impacts the severity of the fires. So basically, we start off with a negative outcome. So that's, we have a fire, and people's homes get destroyed, people have to evacuate, and we say we don't want to do that again. And so then we start putting out fires, which is fire exclusion. And so those fires then aren't removing dead fuel or fine fuels. And so you get more fuel accumulating, and then eventually you have a bigger fire with a worse negative outcome, and the cycle repeats. And so these are some pictures from the Western Rockies of wildland areas. And so this is about 1909, and you can see there are these big trees, and there's just some like low-lying shrubs around them, but no like brush or anything big. Then we go to 1958. You can see there's it's black and white, so it's not the best image, but you can see there's more stuff there, more low-lying branches. And then we get to 1989, and you can see all these small saplings there. And so in this case, it's possible for a much more high intensity fire to move through and ignite those big trees that maybe are still there. Whereas in this case, you could have a small little surface fire going through, and the trees really wouldn't get damaged that much. And it removes any of these saplings from growing. And so you have this like a much more sustainable ecosystem. And when humans come in, we've messed it up basically. And so there's some ways to get rid of this. We want some wildfires, things like prescribed burns where you have low intensity wildfires. Some land management organizations will actually allow low intensity fires to burn. This prevents large ones, but there are problems. People don't like to have a lot of smoke, and that can happen when you have these prescribed fires. And you can also have runaway fires where suddenly that good thing becomes a bad thing. And so it's a tricky problem to solve. And so there's a whole lot of issues there with policy. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk more about what I do for research, which is looking at the physics of how these fires spread, how things are ignited, and how they burn. And really, we're going to look at how does a wildfire spread to its structures and then into a community. And so here I've got this sort of line drawing of a little town, and you can imagine there's maybe a stand of trees over here that's caught on fire for whatever reason, and it's sort of the wildfire is approaching the urban interface, and so now it's a whoopie fire. And these burning trees pose a risk to these homes in several ways. You can have flame radiation, convection, and that convection could be from flame contact. So the hot gases, the flame, are touching the structures. And then also there are these firebrands, those burning pieces of material that get blown by the wind and then can land on things. And so generally speaking, the flame radiation and convection are things we have a better grasp on. I teach undergraduate heat transfer. We've got a textbook. There's entire chapters on convection and radiation. And that is something we can grapple with. There's definitely some trickiness there, but it's not too crazy. The firebrands, though, there's no firebrands chapter in this. And so we've got to find a better way to handle that. Some people have said, oh, it's like conduction, but it's a lot more complicated than conduction. You're burning pieces of wood flying through the air and landing on things. And so there's, I think, a lot of opportunities there to better understand what's going on there. You can also have flame radiation. I'm going to talk about flame radiation in more detail. So if you look closer, we've got that these burning flames are burning trees with the flames, and the flames are emitting radiation across the blank black body spectrum, and some of that heat is being transferred to the structure. And we know if you think back to heat transfer, we have your view factor, and that depends on the separation between the two objects and several other geometric things. And so things like the flame geometry, the height, the depth, and that separation distance play a big role into understanding of whether or not those flames can ignite homes. And historically, the belief was that all of the flame spread processes were driven by radiation, like for wildfires and whoopie fires. And actually, we found recently in the past 10 years, by we, I mean the community, and some people in particular found that it's actually not mostly radiation. Radiation definitely still plays a role, but there's convection and also firebrands are playing a much bigger role than we had thought. And so for convection with flame contact, the way you would they can ignite homes is ultimately you get sort of flame contact on, say, like this piece of ornamental vegetation, it catches fire, and the flames from that maybe ignite the home. So there can be kind of this leapfrog effect near the home. And then finally, those firebrands, it can be they can attack nearby ornamental vegetation, and then you maybe have firebrands to then flame contact as your ignition pathway. But they can also collect on vulnerable components of the house. So for example, if your roof has a bunch of dead pine needles on it and you start getting firebrands landing there, they can ignite that. They can ignite the roof. Wooden decking is a big vulnerability right now. And so you've got your nice wooden deck that you have a barbecue on, but if you've got basically a pile of charcoal that's ignited on it, it's toast. And then also you can have just open windows or vents. Firebrands can go in and land on things inside of the home and ignite them. So there's a lot of work at retrofitting homes to prevent that. And so if you're evacuating for wildfire and have the chance, closing windows isn't a bad idea. But overall, firebrands are found to be responsible for about 50% of structure ignitions. But with the caveat here is it's really hard to measure this. We can't really, you start to show up to a wildfire and say, I want to go collect data and look at homes burning. They're going to tell you to take a hike. I mean, for good reason, it's very dangerous. And so we're still trying to figure this out, but definitely firebrands have been playing a bigger role than we realized. And I mentioned firebrands a bit, but I think it's important to get a better idea of what's going on there. So this is a really cool helicopter footage of a wildfire outside of Los Angeles. And I'll play it again, but there's a bunch of like vegetation up here that's burning. And these waves that look like flames aren't actually flames. Those are collections of little particles that are being blown by the wind, and they're blowing over this highway overpass and then landing below and igniting the grass below with spot fires. And I'll play it again, just highlight too that over here on the left, you can see there are people evacuating, and this is all happening during that process. It's pretty scary. I guess I clicked. And so generally speaking, we try to break up the whole firebrand spotting process into three processes to sort of chunk it into nice research studies and conceptualize them. But first, the firebrands have to be generated, then they have to transport, and during that time they will also burn, and then finally they have to land on a fuel. We have to figure out whether or not they will ignite. So I have some research right now looking at how firebrands are generated, and then also trying to understand how they actually ignite things, under what conditions will they ignite things, because different fuels behave differently, but also you can have a very dry day or a very moist day, and the fuel will have a different moisture level inside of it. And then I had talked before mostly about structures, but eventually you get to the point where you have maybe a subdivision that's being affected by this fire, and the spread of the fire through the community is sort of like the next step out of looking at it. And in this case, you have a little bit of like the leapfrogging effect that I was talking about before. You can have firebrands from these burning vegetation igniting some ornamental vegetation, which then ignites the home, and then that structure, the home burns, produces firebrands, which then ignite an adjacent building. And this is, I think, one area where we don't really have a good sense of trying to think about this at a high level, because we can't just, we're good at modeling flame spread through continuous fuels, but if you've got a bunch of boxes that are arranged in a certain layout with certain separations, and then with little like trees intermixed, we don't really know how to deal with that. And so this is from a NIST report where they create a hypothetical situation where you could say maybe a gazebo gets ignited by firebrands, and the flames from it ignite a combustible fence, and that could travel along the fence to where it maybe would ignite an RV, and then the burning debris from the RV ignites the deck, which ignites the residence. And so you get some of these like swirly flame spread patterns inside the community. And just to sort of give you a maybe a more clear visual, this is an example, I think, of some of that structured ignition process as a fire enters the community. This was in Canada, and you can see there's that big wall of flames on the left where there's some burning trees. And then you'll see some spot fires on the tree lawn on the left, but also on the right. And you can see there's like a bush here that's caught on fire, presumably from firebrands. And you can see some falling on the ground, or maybe that's a little spot fire. And you can see these fires are growing pretty quickly. And there's another one there. And eventually we'll find that they're actually, we're seeing long enough flame lengths that the homes maybe are potentially threatened. And so I think this is a good example of sort of seeing what that looks like on the ground. So, right there, that flame length, you can see the house. There's definitely a perspective effect. It's not easy to disentangle, but it's definitely, it's progressed very rapidly. And so leading into that, I'm going to now talk about one of my research projects looking at the ability of firebrands to ignite fuels. And I want to acknowledge King, my senior PhD student, who is the lead researcher on this. And we recently just published this in Fire Safety Journal. And so he, I'm going to present it, but he gets all the credit because he's the one who did all the work. And this was a combination of experimental and numerical study. And actually, it was most of the time, whenever I've done something like that, we do the experiments first, and then you do the model. You sort of know the answers. It's like taking a class and you've got the answer sheet or something. But in this case, we actually started during the pandemic, and the lab was closed, and Luke was actually starting remotely, and so we actually had to do the modeling first, and then the experiment, which was definitely a little nerve-wracking at times, but actually I think very helpful because the experiment turned out better. And then we just had to go back and change a couple things to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. So I'd recommend taking that leap if you ever are thinking about it, but it's always nice to have the experiments so you know that you're grounded in truth. And so in this, we're looking at, and sort of bringing it back to this drawing before, we're looking at now when firebrands are attacking structural components to understand under what conditions they will ignite. And one thing that happens with structural components in particular is you need to have multiple firebrands. You can't just have one single little piece of burning wood land on something to ignite it. You need a lot of them to ignite something like a wooden deck, because you get these big pieces that can absorb a fair bit of energy. And so in this study in particular, we're trying to understand how close do firebrands have to be to work together to act as a more competent ignition source. If you've got two falling on different parts of the wooden deck, are they actually working together? And if they're close enough, like an inch apart, are they still working together, or are they still effectively separate? So it's maybe a little bit of a more academic look at this ignition pathway. And the motivation again is looking at structure ignition, the campfire. And so we've looked at the firebrand interaction process when these two firebrands are forming an accumulation or maybe not. There's a lot of ways in which they could be what we call cooperatively igniting the fuel, and that means where they're acting together as a more competent ignition source, not two isolated ignition sources. And so one way they can do that is if they're nearby each other, when they're heating the fuel bed, that heating can be cohesive and work together to ignite the fuel. And then at the same time, those firebrands are burning and are losing heat to the environment. And if there's a lot of them nearby, they're maybe not actually losing heat to the environment because they're re-radiating amongst themselves and sort of insulating each other. And then at the same time, there's possibilities for gas-based chemical reaction and for interactions. And so there, in particular, we think maybe this actually isn't so much of a cooperative effect, maybe a hindering effect, where the two firebrands are competing for oxygen to burn because they need it to complete that combustion process. And as they get closer together, that maybe is going to cause some fighting, so to speak. And then also with just the ignition of structural fuels and with firebrands, there's some intrinsic properties to those that are important as well. So for the fuel, obviously the material matters, the shape of it, so the morphology. So if you think of heat transfer, things like the BO number and the thermal thickness play a role here as well, and also the moisture content. So obviously, if your wood's soaking wet, it's going to take a lot of heat to ignite it. But if it's bone dry, it's much more susceptible. And then the firebrands themselves, they can have varying heat release rates. So that's the amount of heat they output or then transfer to the fuel, sizes, combustion states, and then the number and proximity, which I guess goes back to the cooperative ignition effect. And then the environmental conditions such as wind, temperature, and humidity, et cetera. And if I had another slide, I could probably keep going on, but these are mostly the main ones. And so in this study, we are mostly looking at that fuel bed thermal interaction effect, the heat release rate, the size, the number and proximity. And we're trying to understand at what condition do these firebrands act as a group to cooperatively ignite something, and what is the role of thermal interaction. And so one tool we used to do this is we actually didn't use firebrands. We used electrical heaters to simulate firebrands. And the nice thing there is we don't really have to worry about the re-radiation if they're not reacting in the same way. Like the rate at which they produce heat isn't dependent on their temperature and heat losses. Whereas the firebrands cool, they can quench and they stop reacting, and they aren't competing for oxygen. And so we're only looking at that thermal interaction effect. And we looked at the heat produced from these heaters, and then also the size of the heaters, and then their proximity to each other. And so for the study, we use these two electrical cartridge heaters. And so there's sort of rectangular prisms, and there's a heated section. And we use two different sizes, and these dimensions are in millimeters. And we hooked them up to a circuit to control the power. We measured the heat flux that was delivered from them to the fuel surface. When I forget the timings are on. All right, and then the fuel was just a dry pine wood, and we used heat fluxes that are representative of firebrand piles. And so goes from 10 to 60 kilowatts per meter squared. And so some frame reference, about 20 kilowatts per meter squared is a heat flux that in a room, a building fire could cause flashover. And then afterwards, you may have heat fluxes in excess of like 50 kilowatts per meter squared easily. And then the separation distances we considered were fairly close. It was between 0 and 30 millimeters or 3 centimeters. And we only looked at whether they would ignite with a flame or if they didn't ignite. It's also possible to have smoldering ignition, which is a flameless combustion, but we didn't study that. If you've ever studied smoldering combustion, it's important, but it's also incredibly slow. And in our case, it didn't really make sense with the way our heaters were configured. But it's also something that maybe somebody else should study. And so we did these tests with the different sizes, different separation distances, and heat fluxes. And we repeated the tests multiple times and looked at how many of the times the test resulted in ignition or no ignition. And so then we drew a circle for each test condition, and then we colored it according to this color bar. If it was none of the cases ignited, we colored it black. If all of them ignited it, we said it was, we colored it white. And if it was in between, we used whatever fraction here. And you can see that actually our cases were very consistent. We only had 3 cases that weren't all ignition or all no ignition. And then we fit a curve using logistic regression to find the boundary separating cases that would ignite from those that wouldn't. Or more specifically, it's like the 50% ignition probability line. And as I'm skipping ahead. And what we can see here is that for the smaller size, as you increase the separation distance, the required heat flux increases. And then eventually you get to a point at about 30 millimeters, where then if you take out the second heater, it barely changes anything. And so in that case, they're separated far enough that they're effectively isolated. But for the big heater, that critical separation distance happened at 10 millimeters. And so at 10 millimeters, if you took out the second one, you still got the same result. And so what this tells us is that the bigger heater case, they're acting as a more competent ignition source, and it sort of doesn't need the second heater there. And the other way to look at this too is in the cases that did ignite, how long did it take them to ignite? And if there's a cooperative ignition effect, how would we measure it? Well, we looked at, does the ignition time decrease? And so plotted over here, we have the time it took for the sample to ignite as a function of the separation distance. And we use the different heat fluxes. The higher the heat flux, the shorter the ignition time, so the easier it ignited. And then if you look as a function of separation distance for a given heat flux, the ignition time increases and then sort of levels off. And so what we found was for these cases, we could actually non-dimensionalize this data in a way that showed that they would all fall on the same curve, or they'd fall on this. First, there would be this region where they increase with a non-dimensionalized separation distance, and then they would sort of level off, and that's where they're acting as a single flaming ignition, not as a group. And this non-dimensionalization, we took the case with 2 firebrands and compared it to the relevant case with only 1, and then we non-dimensionalized the distance based on the time it would take the thermal wave from each of those heating sources to meet. And so if we do that scaling, it collapses down, and what that tells us is that the time at which they, or the critical separation distance for them to act together is dependent on those thermal waves to touch and interact. So we are seeing thermal interactions in the fuel bed. It's not something else, or at least if it is, it's following the exact same trend we would expect. And I don't know what we do that. Yeah. And so then for our model, we decided to model it in 2D, even though it is somewhat of a 3D problem, and that did cause some disagreement in the end. But we changed the firebrand size. And so the nice thing with the model is we can do almost whatever we want. And so we did a much more broader span of firebrand sizes and heat fluxes and looked at different separation distances. And the way we represented the problem on the fuel was we had a heat flux over a small patch here and here. We separated them by a distance. And this isn't to scale, but actually it's basically like a semi-infinite boundary condition on the sides and the bottom. We just insulated them because we had to in the solver. And then the way the model worked was first it would heat them, and then eventually you would get pyrrolysate gases being formed. And so the wood is decomposing and turning into char or charcoal, and it's producing what we call thermal pyrrolysate. So this is an endothermic process. We have to dump heat into the fuel, and it produces gaseous fuel that comes off. And then at the same time, it can weakly react with some oxygen to form char and some oxidative pyrrolysate, which is also another fuel. And then those things, if there's enough of them, they could potentially ignite. They come in, they mix with oxygen and come into contact with an ignition source. And so in this case, we're thinking about two firebrands landing on this fuel, and those firebrands are going to be glowing red hot. And so we're going to say that's basically a good ignition pilot. And you could argue with me about that, and I think there's definitely some cases where maybe they wouldn't, but more or less we said that's good enough. And we said that they will ignite if there's a critical mass flux for ignition, and there's some, and this depends on several things, but like the specific configuration you have, the fuel. But for this fuel, we found in literature a value of around 1.8, and we also replicated that with some experiments using some standard tests, and we got basically the same answer. So we stuck with that. And we're assuming the ignition, the firebrand acts like a pilot. So basically, we're monitoring from the output data the mass flux coming off the surface here. And once it hits this critical value, we say, all right, it ignited. And so unfortunately, we don't actually look at the actual flame that gets formed at all, but we just post-process it and find it this way. And so our domain, we're only doing the solid phase and using like a porous media solver. And so if you want to see the governing equations, I'm going to quickly go through this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but basically we looked at the condensed phase, mass conservation, species conservation, and then the combined energy equation of the gas that's trapped in the wood and the wood itself and all the other condensed phase species. And then in the wood itself, the gas phase, mass conservation, species conservation. And so if you want, you can look at the paper to see what everything means, but I think that's not the most important thing. And so we used a grid size of 0.5 and 2D Cartesian, and we used this solver GPyro. And so the results, we found that basically as the firebrand size was increased, the required heat flux to ignite the fuel decreased, and that kind of makes sense. And it's sort of a hyperbolic relationship, and this agrees with some cases that have been done for hot metal particles igniting things. So we're seeing the same trends we'd expect. But now when we add the second firebrand, we find that this curve shifts depending on the separation distance. And so as we increase the separation distance, the curve approaches eventually that curve for the single case. I don't actually know which one's the pointer, but for this one, so this line is that L goes to infinity case. And so that was nice, but we wanted to find a way to present this that was more like how we presented the experimental data. And so we've now plotted them. Each subplot is the size of the heater, and then the horizontal axis is the separation distance, and then the vertical axis is the heat flux. And we looked at cases where we took each test condition and marked it as either a no ignition case, a single ignition case, or a cooperative ignition case. And so it was a cooperative ignition. Ignition was made possible where it wasn't when there was one heater, or ignition was faster than compared to the case when they had one heater. And we see similar behavior to what we would expect from the experiments. And yeah, I said all that. And then in the model, we are also able to look at the temperature profile in the wood, which is really nice. And I think this is a case of, why you would use a model versus experiments. And so here, if we wanted to do something like this, we could maybe, Swiss cheese our wood sample and put a bunch of thermocouples in it. And then you might also say, okay, well, we're really messing with that sample, so that's not going to help. But if we can use a model here and get an idea of what's going on. And what we see here is that when there is a strong thermal interaction, the waves, that characteristic distance of those thermal waves is much greater than the separation distance over 2. So the waves have definitely met. The heat transfer in the solid is, it's not two isolated cases, they're definitely merged together. And then when there's a weak interaction, we see it's basically about equal. And then finally, when there's no thermal interaction, it's much less. And so in this case, you might say, okay, well, there is something going on here, but actually that's a temperature range of 50 to 100 degrees Celsius. And so that's below the boiling point of water. And so if you're looking at something like biomass burning, that's pretty low. And so it's not really something we're worried about. And at the same time, in this case, that they're losing more heat to the center, and that acts as an additional heat loss to the fuel underneath. And so then we compared our results to the model, and we got some mixed results. We see the same general trend, and for the large firebrand case, we see very similar behavior here for the no ignition case, but for determining cooperation versus single ignition, it wasn't the best agreement. It wasn't perfect, which makes sense. It's a 2D model in a 3D experiment. We're definitely, we shouldn't expect it to be the same. However, for the smaller case, the agreement's much worse. We do see the same qualitative behavior, but in this case, we think the smaller heater, because they were larger separation distances and it's smaller, it's acting, the 3D effects are a lot bigger there. And that's why we're seeing more disagreement. So the main conclusions for this were that we could examine the thermal interaction in ignition of fuel by 2 or 1 idealized firebrand, and we were able to do that through experiments and modeling. Thermal interaction can increase firebrand's ignition capabilities and make ignition possible or faster. And for larger single firebrands, they can ignite a fuel with a lower heat flux compared to smaller ones. And the ignition capability of smaller firebrands can be enhanced by the proximity of a second firebrand, depending on the separation distance. And then larger firebrands are almost too strong of an ignition source to really have that second firebrand pay off, so to speak. And it's weird to say it in that sense because we're trying to prevent the fires. But in a lot of combustion scenarios, so I come from more of a engines and aircraft combustion applications where you want to have things burn. Whereas in this case, you don't. So I find myself tripping over the language sometimes. And so then I'm going to talk very quickly about some ongoing research we have as sort of a follow-on study to this. In this case, we're trying to look at oxygen competition when you've got a firebrand pile. And so, it's the same sort of possible parameters, but here we're looking at gas-phase chemical interaction and the number of firebrands in their proximity, and then also how the wind or the airflow around affects the interaction process. And so in this case, we actually used real firebrands, and we basically had a propane burner. We have like a fry basket, we cook them, and once they get, they burn with the flame and the flame goes out, we then take the glowing firebrands and we deposit them. It's a complicated process involving a funnel, and it's a little bit chaotic, but they land on the fuel and we get different loading densities. And we're looking at if they're a very dense firebrand accumulation, maybe there's going to be more competition, where if it's more dispersed, maybe there's going to be less competition. At least that's our hypothesis. And in these initial cases that I'll show you, we didn't actually use any wind, but we're in the process of doing these in a small bench scale wind tunnel. And so what we find is we get an image here, and actually I didn't mention it on the previous slide, but what we do, we use ratio pyrometric imaging of the firebrands. And so what we're doing is we're taking like a digital camera, so a normal DSLR camera, and we're getting the raw image that comes off of it. If you've ever done photography and touched up a picture afterwards, you want the raw image because it's the camera actually does a ton of post-processing when it makes a JPEG for you. And if you're a scientist, you want none of that. You want to have full control. You want to get like a real raw sensor readout. And so the raw image, you can actually take the red value and the green value and gain some spectral insight into the Planck distribution that's producing the glowing that we see in the firebrands. And so you can actually make a calibration curve relating the ratio of red and green light seen in each pixel to a temperature that would produce that. And so this is very nice because if you've ever gotten a quote for a FLIR camera, it's enough to give you a heart attack, especially at high temperatures. Whereas for this, we used a $1,000 camera, which is pretty nice. But I've also had students use like a Raspberry Pi camera. And I think in that case, they were able to have, for the temperature range they were trying to buy something with, or they were trying to look at, they could buy the Raspberry Pi camera setup and a Jaguar, or they could buy a FLIR camera. And so that gives you an idea of the range of price there. But so anyways, we got these images, and we used that ratio pyrometry to identify regions where there was this glowing combustion. So that's flameless combustion where there's a lot of heat release. And we looked at the spatial distribution of that. So we segmented the image into different concentric square rings. And then we looked at what fraction of each of those rings was experiencing glowing combustion or wasn't. And for the case where we had a very dispersed accumulation density, they basically were all the same. It was a very homogeneous combustion activity. Whereas if you go to the very high loading density, we saw that the outermost ring had substantially more glowing happening than the innermost rings. And so if you think about the boundary layer that's happening here, you've got basically a bunch of firebrands on a square. And so it's like a hot plate. And so you get a boundary layer that looks sort of like not quite a cone, I guess, but near the edges, you have the boundary layer developing, and the parts on the outside get the most oxygen. And in the center, there isn't quite as much. And so they don't glow as much or produce as much heat. And then I'm just going to very briefly talk about some opportunities that I see for movie fire research in the movie fire area. So I had mentioned before, wildfires and I guess movie fires fall into this too, are a merger of a lot of different groups. There's like forestry and ecology, as I like to call it, like the tree people. They care about the species of the plant. They care about, what does the cell membrane look like? You've got pests that are involved. And I don't really think that way. Some of that has impacts on how I would think about it when I'm in engineering, but you also have fire management. And so a lot of the terms that are used by the people who are actually going out to these fires, getting really dirty, breathing in a lot of smoke, and making the world safer. And so they have their own way of talking about it. And then also there's the risk and insurance. And so these are the people who are maybe insuring your house, so that if it burns down, you can rebuild. And they like to think about these things as a probabilistic, using like a probabilistic framework. And so they think about it another way. Whereas I would say engineering, you maybe would have some crosstalk with, it's hard to draw a Venn diagram with more than like 3 things and have it really legible. So you can sort of imagine they're all interacting in my mind. But engineering, you may take some things, some knowledge from forestry and ecology, risk and insurance, or even fire management, and then try to understand how does physical insight here help us to better understand wildfires and maybe reduce the negative outcomes from those. And so something that I've been doing is doing imaging-based measurements for things like firebrands. Firebrands are really annoying because you can't measure them with a lot of the things we're used to. In fire, some of the biggest fire research, some of the biggest tools are thermocouples and heat flux gauges, which is really a piece of metal with 2 thermocouples on it. Well, it depends on the heat flux gauge. But anyways, those don't work very well. During this study where I imaged a firebrand as it burned, I was planning on comparing the measurement to what I would measure with a thermocouple. And so I got the smallest thermocouple I could find. It was really high performance, put it on the surface, and it turned it black because the thermocouple was cooling the surface. And so that was, not what I was expecting. But I think it goes to show that you have to sort of think outside the box for some of these things. So I found this imaging-based methods are very nice because the firebrand's also moving through the air. It's not a problem. In this case, as these were actually metal sparks, not firebrands, but more or less the same. But they would create motion blurred streaks. And so the streaks I could use to get the velocity. So I could get temperature and velocity of those. And so there's a lot of opportunities there. I think one case where we need measurements and models and everything is structure to structure spread. This is a lot of the radiation and convection that we see. Those processes scale differently with size. And so you can't really do a scale model in a small wind tunnel to then size that up to a community. Or maybe you can do that somewhat, but it's not going to be complete. And so on some level, we've got to study these things at these bigger scales. And some national labs have actually been doing big tests where they have one burning shed and a burning building next to it, and they change the separation distance. And you can imagine this is like a big undertaking. They write reports about their they had a report about their test, about the setup for their test plan. It was reports for reports for reports. But it's very expensive and very hard. Also, wildfire emissions are a very big thing. While living in the Bay Area, where I went to grad school, there were several wildfires that caused us to have even classes canceled. So in Massachusetts, things like snow days are very common. And I always like to tell them, like, well, we used to have pollution days. And the school, of course, would wait till it hit the worst absolute limit on the EPA website. It was very, very unhealthy. And then they closed. Unhealthy is okay. Students can go to school. But we need ways to better understand those emissions. And also how things like structures and wildland fuels contribute to that, because each of those will be different. And that's a big area because we need to know first what's coming off of those things, but then also how do they get dispersed over large distances. And so a lot of the fires like that campfire were very far away, but they were affecting areas much farther away from them. And then also some of these measurements can go towards things like wildfire detection and detecting fires while they're small so that we can respond to them quickly and contain them. And then also things like predicting structure-to-structure spread. I think there's a lot of room here. Right now, there isn't a lot out there that does this. We have a lot of wildland fire models that can predict spread fairly well. But these are continuous fuels, and that's a much easier problem. And we'll say we're not perfect, though. There's a lot of, well, I would say one thing we can do is we know all the physics. So in theory, it should be a solvable problem. But the problem is that we can't actually solve that in any sort of realistic time frame. If you look at here, this diagram shows the different length scales that you might have to deal with. So a reaction times or a length scale, so that's like a flame, the thickness of a diffusion flame. So we're around an order of like micrometers. But then we've got this fire that's on the size of kilometers. And you can't really make an efficient computational tool that solves all of this at the same time. You've got to pick out what are your most important physics and study those, but you can't do everything. And I think for movie fires, we don't really have a good way of also doing things like discrete structures, firebrands. Right now, generation of firebrands, we don't have good ways of implementing that. There's actually a big fire modeling tool that has a way of generating them, but they freely admit this kind of works for the very basic, conceptual ideas. We have no idea if it's right, which is a little scary. And then also, under what conditions will those firebrands emit structures? And these we're talking about, a lot of physics here. But if you're a firefighter on the ground and trying to make decisions, you can't really just run something on a very detailed CFD model where you're resolving things at all these scales and then getting an answer. And so you've got to find a way to take some shortcuts so you can get something that gets you a good enough answer in a good enough amount of time. And also another important thing are things like structured defense. So things like passive fire protection, so choosing fire-resistant materials, construction, and even landscaping, which as an engineer, things I didn't think I would be commenting on, but how much ornamental vegetation you have on your land plays a big role. And there's also active fire protection, things like exterior sprinklers, which in some cases they're good, but in other cases they aren't really that effective. And there's a lot of talk of using new technology like robots, drones, like ChatGPT. And I think a big limitation here is that you need to find ways to make these compatible with fire service operations and solutions that are scalable. So for example, drones, what I'm thinking here, like quadcopters or something of that level. There's a lot of opportunities there, but I've heard proposals of people trying to say they're going to use a swarm of drones to put out fires. And that's a lot of water. And those things are very small. And you aren't really going to be able to do anything that effective. And things like drones, if they're flying around in the air, the fire service won't want to fly bigger planes with fire suppressant. And so you have to find ways to work with the existing framework. And I think now there's maybe the tide is turning of finding some places for these things. But you've got to have that, I guess, like reference check of, can this actually be helpful? And then the last thing I was going to mention was also looking at what differences you can make on the community scale. And so one thing is evacuations is a very hard topic. And along with that, detecting the fires and also notifying people of what to do in the appropriate amount of time is really important. And then also things like infrastructure like the electrical grid, you need to have in place to support a lot of these things like notifications. And this can be both an ignition source or something that can be damaged. And so you need to find ways to harden it from fires and prevent fires. And this image is from the campfire, and there were a lot of people that were caught trying to evacuate and had to abandon their cars. And so I think it's a good reminder. So thank you.